And now I'll move on and welcome our next speaker. Brad Lipps is the CEO of the Atlas Network, and as with all other speakers, you can read his sort of formal bio in the program. I do want to say that Brad personally and the Atlas Network are someone that we owe a great debt of gratitude to. Those of you who've been coming for a few years might remember that originally this started off even before myself and Jana got involved. And then even when we got involved, we would do 2 or 3 events over the course of a year. And it was kind of a part-time thing. And then in 2008, I discovered Atlas and discovered there are people all over the world who do stuff like this full-time for a job. And they get paid for it. And I thought that was really cool. So, yeah, I'm happy to say now that I'm one of those people who do things like this full-time for a job and gets paid for it.
You're fired.
Although I never seem to make the 90-day period because Peter's always firing me. But my probationary status notwithstanding, the fact that I'm able to be here and do this is in large part due to the support of people like Brad and Atlas, who not only funded us with advice, with financial help, and also welcomed me into their office for a few weeks, or actually a couple months in the summer of 2008, where I also took part in the think tank MBA training. And the reason we've asked Brad to be here, not only for him to see this, because I know he's been itching to come up for a little while, but is also so that he can share with you some of the stories about people who do these things kind of all over the world. And not all of them work in North America and argue over marginal tax rates. Some of them work in really dangerous places, and they fight really tough battles for liberty. And so that's what Brad's going to be talking about. Please help me welcome him.
Okay, so thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. And he's right, I've been itching to come here ever since I heard about it, probably 5 or 6 years ago. When I was in my 20s, if you were to come to a gathering, anything like this, you'd expect to hear a lot of socialism. But now to look out, beautiful scenery, good food, good folks, and an appreciation for property rights, I'm in my element. And to get to talk about my favorite topic is pretty special. I'm going to tell you about some individuals who do what I consider truly heroic work all around the world to try to protect individual rights, limit government, and open up free markets. We call them freedom champions in sort of Atlas parlance, and you know them. Matt and Janet and Peter are the examples of the kind of people that we try to work with, who are creating new institutions, creating new programs to try to get the ideas in circulation, get them discussed by people who are serious about trying to change the world. And at Atlas, we have the privilege of working with groups all across the U.S., a bunch in Canada, but then also in a total of 90 countries around the world. We have think tank partners, 400 in number, but we get to be working with people that are kind of pushing the frontier of the freedom movement, so to speak. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Because when you hear some of their stories, I think you can't help but be inspired. I find them inspiring, and some of the places where we actually find some hope, amid all the gloomy headlines. There's so many things happening today that, it feels like headlines right out of Atlas Shrugged. It's like, I always thought Rand was a little bit overwrought with some of her predictions, but they seem to be coming true. But there are hopeful things going on, and sometimes it's in some of these kind of hopeless countries where they can inspire us the most. But I thought I'd actually start out, before I tell you some of the stories, by telling you how I got to be involved with Atlas and became so passionate about its work. I was working for a couple years on Wall Street after I finished school. Found myself really tired of being overpaid, and actually that was the good part. But I did decide, I was in my 20s, and I figured that I was young enough that I could stomach a 2/3 paid cut and do something that I thought was important and that I loved. And at that point, I had sort of become aware of the bad math behind the entitlement state. And I thought, in my working lifetime, there's going to be a showdown between those that want to increase government control and those who are going to fight for individual liberty and the traditions that made the U.S. a beacon of freedom for so long. And I wanted to be a part of that. I sort of had become aware of Milton Friedman and people that had solutions that sounded right to me, and I wanted to be involved in that history and stand with the people who were on the right side of it. So I came down to the D.C. policy world, and I was fired up to fight any battle that was anywhere on our side. Reducing or eliminating capital gains taxes. For me, that's a moral issue. But I realized that all my lefty friends back at Princeton, that's a kind of issue where they just closed their ears. They wouldn't even listen to the argument because they just said, oh, I get it. You guys are for the rich and we're for the poor. And that's where they'd stop listening. But when I first came to an Atlas conference, I started to say, oh, I wish my Princeton friends could be here. Because it was there that I met a guy from Ghana who was giving a talk about the way that well-intentioned foreign aid programs undermined local agriculture markets. The people that were trying to develop something that would sustain their countries for the long term were the ones that were actually hurt by so-called benevolent foreign aid programs. I met another African, I think at a conference right after that, who said, Brad, what do you think happened to the best and brightest students that I went to university with? Well, with World Bank programs in my country, they want drivers who can speak really good English. So, these really good students, they didn't go on to become doctors. They didn't start their own businesses. They're sitting in cars on the side of the road, waiting for somebody more important than them to get out of a meeting and go to the next one. They're just limo drivers. It made me think about some of the unintended consequences that happen abroad. The same way that we think about the unintended consequences of big government intervention, in the U.S. and in Canada. So, here in seeing the righteous indignation in the eyes of these different African think tank leaders made me realize that we're not only going to win these policy arguments, we need to win people's hearts. And the international freedom champions that Atlas gets to work with, I think, really illuminate the fact that we stand on the moral high ground that the left likes to occupy. And we just have to do a better job of telling those stories. So I sort of became very invested in this idea that the crowd that Atlas works with was part of a solution to winning this moral argument. But I started to question as I heard about what the sort of the mechanics of the Atlas strategy is. I started to think, well, are think tanks really the vehicle to make a difference over the long term? And I came to conclude that they are, but they're not going to have an impact as fast as we'd like, But in the war of ideas, I don't think there are any shortcuts. So, we have to be patient. And that's why Atlas has this strategy of trying to plant institutions that for the long term are going to be out there trying to win new audiences to the ideas that we all care about. For sort of evidence of how this can play out over years, perhaps decades, you have to just look at the origins of Atlas. So the organization that I now have the privilege of running was founded 32 years ago by a man named Anthony Fisher. And Fisher had first gotten involved in the think tank world before there really was a think tank world. Leonard Read had FEE, but Anthony Fisher founded in the mid-50s a group called the Institute of Economic Affairs. And when Thatcher came to power, nearly 25 years later, she said, it was this organization that is allowing me to privatize what had been nationalized. It's giving me the public support to stand up to the public employee unions that were sort of outside the rule of law at the time. So people started to ask Anthony Fisher, how did you do it? How can we replicate the success of this kind of organization that over a generation changed Britain from being heavily socialist to undergoing the Thatcher Revolution? Anthony had already been involved in the founding of the Fraser Institute out in Vancouver. You all know the impact that Fraser's had. The Manhattan Institute in New York. And then he started Atlas with this idea that you can sort of take a cookie cutter and replicate this model wherever there are people that want to make a difference. And one of the early groups that he got involved with after the founding of Atlas was called the Instituto Libertad y Democracia in Peru, run by a guy named Hernando de Soto. And all of these think tanks are great examples of having major impact in the world of ideas. People talk about welfare reform in the 1990s really having its roots in Charles Murray's work with the Manhattan Institute that Fisher was involved in back in the 80s. The book Losing Ground changed the debate. The work that Hernando de Soto has done totally revolutionized development economics, making it a story of how do you bring the poor out of black markets, how do you give them title to their property. And when you look at other more recent victories for the cause, I think about Michigan. We've all been watching what's gone on in Detroit recently, but back in December, there was a really exciting story about right-to-work legislation being passed in a state that's known as the bastion of unionism. Well, if it hadn't been for Larry Reed and the Mackinac Center that he founded, doing this kind of work over 20 some odd years, we might not have had that victory. So I think you see the fingerprints of think tanks on a whole number of policy victories these days. And it's a testimony to the fact that we can make a difference by working in the world of ideas, but also that we have to be patient, that we never know where the next opportunity is going to open up. And that's why Atlas has this strategy of trying to work with people from around the world, wherever they have the dream, and we can try to arm them with some support and some guidance, because we don't know if the next political opportunity is going to appear in that country, and we know that we have to be in it for the long term. Of course, some of the work that we do is really about protecting ground that we thought had been won. If you look at Eastern Europe, just about 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're seeing backsliding in different countries. Have you heard about what's going on in Hungary? This has been on the minds of a lot of us at Atlas. We've had a program with a Hungarian partner for a year now, trying to put more attention there, because there's a movement that is sort of economic nationalism, hardcore xenophobia. I don't think I'm abusing the term to say there's a neo-Nazi movement in Hungary that is sanctioned by some of the parties that are in power. The prominent member of the Jobbik party in parliament had called for a public listing of Jews as national security threats. And what was kind of especially disturbing is that it was the communist left that was actually the ones that were first standing up against this. And we looked and said, there needs to be a different narrative. This sort of Nazi communist thing is way too 1930s. We need to be in the conversation. And we came across a guy named Zoltan Ketz, who had the dream and the vision to create something called the Free Market Foundation. So we've been working with Zoltan over the last 18 months or so to get his organization off the ground, giving it some seed funding that he's now been able to match with local funding in Hungary. And they're doing a project called Ridicule the Radicals, which has a number of components, but the whole idea is to create a groundswell of a student movement, along with serious research, and bringing on some former economic ministers to be making public pronouncements to really draw attention to the insanity of some of the extremism that's taken hold in Hungary. And Zoltan is a wonderful example for us, because he came through our think tank MBA program that Matt alluded to, and that Matt attended, and Janet's now signed up for next in this coming November. But Zoltan, after he completed our think tank MBA program, which is sort of our 2-week boot camp, to really make you work on your strategic plan and to really think through a lot of the mechanics of how you're going to run an organization. Management processes are never very glamorous, but they're essential if we're going to be more effective in spreading the ideas. Zoltan finished that program, and then he wrote to us. He said, "I'm now going back to my country he said, no, sorry. I'm fired up now to save my country. I'm going back, and I'm going to save Hungary. This is how I feel, and I'm inspired to do it." And what I think is really exciting is that at Atlas, we're now finding more people like Zoltan in countries where we never really had a foothold before. In the Arabic-speaking world, there's a man named Noua El Hermouzi, who's been running our Arabic language project for the last 5 years, who's now formalized his operation in Morocco, running freedom schools in Tunisia, in Lebanon, in Egypt, and getting works that we sort of take for granted, that you can read your John Stuart Mill and your John Locke, and when Steve Horowitz says you need to read these libertarian classics, you can find them in English. You can't find them in Arabic, but that's changing because of the team that Noua has built, and they've now formalized their operation in Morocco. So a serious effort to get our ideas out in the Arabic-speaking world. Even in Iran, we're now having some traction, which surprises me. We'd been running a Persian language program for the last few years, all using Iranian exiles, and trying to, with a website that we had to keep sort of tweaking to escape censors, trying to get the ideas into Iran. But what's been interesting is there's now commercial publishers that have been taking our work, a lot of it on economic topics and not on explicitly political ones, because there's obviously a lot of sensitivity to all of that. But they've been republishing our work in Iran. So we have this wonderful photo. I couldn't believe it when it came through less than a year ago, of a Tehran bookstore with the morality of capitalism that some of you, especially the SFL folks here, will recognize. But in Persian print, and then in a Tehran bookstore, reviewed in leading newspapers in Tehran. So traction there in a place I never thought we were going to see progress. I was thinking it would be fun to tell you a little bit about Africa. There's actually a neat headline here. We've had a lot of difficulty getting freestanding, self-sustaining think tanks to operate in Africa. Just like the philanthropic culture is tough, and the people who are really talented get bid away by other opportunities. But so we've sort of changed our strategy, working more on the building of student groups and then connecting them to Students for Liberty. I understand there were 320 people at the African Students for Liberty conference that started yesterday. Is that? Yeah. So, way to go. So that's kind of remarkable, and a lot of the outreach that has, I think, put together that growing African movement has been done through a guy named Adedayo Thomas, who works for our africaliberty.org platform. And it's kind of fun to share how Adedayo has gone about trying to build a movement across Africa, because he found that he was getting very little traction when he would call up universities and say, "My name's Adedayo, I want to come tell your students about liberty." No, we don't want that. So he came up with a different strategy. He got us to take book donations from Cato and other friendly organizations. We got one of those huge shipping containers, sent it over to Nigeria to, so he could put it in a warehouse where he now has these books as sort of the capital that he uses to get an entree to these universities. So now he calls up and says, "My name's Adedayo, and I learned that you have a wonderful library at your university. I'd like to make a book donation, and I'd like to do this in a way that we can celebrate the amazing administrators who put together the library and had the vision to help students across Africa." So he totally butters him up, gets in the door, and then says, "By the way, you should have student groups discussing these ideas. Let me take down your emails, give me your cards. If you're interested in these ideas of liberty, this is, I'm the guy to talk to." So, slowly that type of, entrepreneurship has built a growing network in Africa, which is going to be pretty exciting. And I guess that I'll add one more thing about Adedayo, because it's fun. So he comes to us, a year and a half ago now, I guess, saying, these outreaches are going pretty well, but I think I could be more successful, Brad, if the Atlas team would fund me to bring along a troupe of musicians and dancers. And that's just not the kind of thing that usually crosses my desk. This is crazy. What are you talking about? But it sort of made sense. Adedayo said, well, street theater is what captures the attention of anybody in Africa. If we get people to come to this grand event about their library, there's going to be some interested people, but a lot of people are dozing off. So Adedayo had taken it upon himself to do sort of an African version of Ken Schoolin's Jonathan Gullible story, which sort of takes the central ideas of Rand, why are we going to punish those that succeed in business? He set them to music and dance, and we now have rather incoherent. We've decided we just can't turn it into a good YouTube video because it's just shot pretty poorly. But Adedayo has had this troupe going to different African universities to do this staged production to get the ideas of essentially Ayn Rand out in front of African students, and then encourages them to stay connected, and then ultimately link up with the SFL crew. So all this is to say that think tank work around the world takes many different forms. The bread and butter is still serious scholarly research papers, but here we are in the rain under a tent. Adedayo is dancing on stage in front of groups of African university students. And from our perspective at Atlas, all this experimentation and innovation is what's needed. We need to multiply it, because the power of our network is when something succeeds in one place, we can try it in other places. And my dream is that we'll have successful programs that are multiplied across the network. And those programs will beget successful policy reforms. And successful policy reforms create successful countries. And we'll have more useful contrasts to tell our story. So I think Milton Friedman knew what he was doing in Free to Choose when he stood on the rock that is Hong Kong, right off the shore of China, saying, this rock has grown prosperous. Over there, this is still 1978, 79. Over there in China, it's an economic basket case. Like, what made this rock with no natural resources more prosperous than that country over there? Some of you have probably seen. Have you seen the satellite images of Korea at night, where it's the south illuminated in prosperity, and then the north looking as completely dark and desolate as it must have looked 300 years ago. In Latin America, we're always drawing the contrast between the Chileans who made free market reforms and what's happened in Venezuela, where it's an Ayn Rand novel. Here in North America, so I liked how the welcome letter here kind of poked fun at us Americans with the note that, welcome to the freest country in North America now. So, we do have this contrast, Canada's done a few things right, and, the U.S. is sliding down in these scores of economic freedom. So, that these are, they're big stakes. We're talking about the future of countries. So I hope you all here agree that, it's important work that we're endeavoring to do, and that think tanks can change the conversation. And we can move the conversation with persistent work over a number of years and actually change people's lives. That's what we're aiming to do. The freedom champions that I've mentioned, I take a lot of inspiration from them, and as Matt kind of said, you have a chance to meet them all because we try to bring them from all around the world to our big New York event. So if you're of the age, definitely enter the essay contest. But I'll give a quick pitch for our Liberty Forum program because it's my favorite time of the year. We get people from about 50 different countries to come together for this 2-day summit that we do in New York City. And there's a lot of serious policy discussion. There's also discussion of think tank strategies, projects that are working. We've made it a little bit lively over the last couple of years to make it a little more entertaining to those who aren't already in the movement. So we have one competition that we call Think Tank Shark Tank. I don't know if it's in Canada. Do you have the Shark Tank program?
It's called Dragon's Den.
Is it Dragon's Den here?
And I believe it started here and was exported to the U.S.
Started in Japan, actually.
Japan.
Really?
Everything started.
Okay, well, we've stolen it. Yeah. So in the televised version, you have business people who are pitching their small businesses to venture capitalists, trying to get them to take an equity stake and grow their business. For ours, we have a panel of judges of free market philanthropists, and they're hearing presentations from think tanks that have gone through our training programs who are competing for a $25,000 grant to get a new project up and running. And last year, the institute that won is called the UK Taxpayers Alliance, and they were protesting this escalation in the beer tax, which happens in the UK and was scheduled to go up. And they put together this campaign, which really revolved around a lot of media promotion, but also distributing 350,000. They call them beer mats. I call them coasters to different pubs across London that sort of boiled down the stats, and it sort of came to the every time that you buy, for every 2 beers that you buy, you're basically buying one for the tax man. And that's like his share of what's going on. So they create a little bit of public outrage, and actually were able to not only delay the escalation that was scheduled, but cause a slight decline in the beer tax. So, a small victory for liberty, more beer for us, less money for them, and we'll take it. And it was fun that it sort of had its roots at our little think tank Shark Tank competition. Another highlight that we have is at our the gala freedom dinner, which is sort of like the grand finale of the program. We do Toast to Freedom, and we often get them done by people that come from very difficult countries. And the star of last year's show was Chen Guangcheng, the human rights lawyer who was in world headlines last April. Chen is a human rights activist, a lawyer who had drawn a lot of attention to abuses in enforcing the one-child policy, forced abortions and horrible things going on in China. And he wound up under house arrest. He was sort of illegally detained by provincial authorities. but somehow, he's blind. He was able to escape house arrest, managed to break a couple bones in his foot as he escaped, got through some woods, was picked up by friends of ours that work with the Transition Institute, and with their help made it to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and then there was that sort of international uncertainty for a few days before he ultimately was able to come to the U.S. So as sort of a favor to his friends at Transition that Atlas has been able to help over the last few years, he came to our dinner, and Chen was working through a translator, and it's always stressful putting on these sort of big gala events and not knowing how it's going to go, especially with people up at a mic that don't speak the language. So it was a little bit difficult going in the early part of what he was trying to say, but then he's totally pulled it together. He ended his toast saying, as I see it, the true meaning of this freedom dinner is that someday we'll be able to toast freedom in any part of the world. I was like, yeah, the guy nailed it. So it was a special moment, and that's sort of the theme behind what we try to do at the conference, and that's really what Atlas is all about. I think I promised at the beginning I'd try to make you feel a little bit more hopeful, and maybe I'd do that by telling a story from a place that I would have on my list of God-forsaken countries where you might think the struggle is doomed to fail. That would be Afghanistan, because I have only heard horrible things about Afghanistan maybe my entire life. But then I met a man named Professor Mohammad Ramzipour, and he had established the Afghanistan Economic and Legal Studies Organization. Atlas's Tom Palmer had just been going over to Kabul and then was told, hey, there's a human rights lawyer who understands economics and is a guy to meet with. And Tom met with him a few times, said, okay, this is somebody that we should be working with, and gave him a little bit of funding, did some cool projects. He now runs roundtables around Kabul, but he's really focused a lot on radio programs. So now in like 3/4 of Afghanistan's provinces, you can access radio programs that he's developed on the virtues of tolerance, on entrepreneurship, on the rule of law. And it's an impressive amount of work he's been able to pull together, still operating really on a shoestring budget. He finally came to the U.S., when was it, like a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. And so I got to meet him face to face for the first time, and I said, how do you find the courage to go on? Everything I hear about the corruption in Afghanistan would make me think that it's just got to be tough to see where progress is going to start. And he said, well, Brad, I understand. I don't want to say there are no challenges ahead. My country has many difficulties, but this is the most hopeful time in my country's history while I've been alive. And he said, think about what I've lived through. The dictatorship of the Taliban, the Soviet occupation. And then he told this story that I found just, kind of heart-wrenching, because he and I are about the same age, and I know just how carefree my life was in December of 1979 when I was 9 years old, watching Chicago Bears games and eating Cheetos on the couch and everything. But Muhammad's life was a little bit different. That was the month that Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. And he said that his father convened him and his brother and had this conversation. His father was a book collector, which I guess was not very common in their village outside of Kabul. And he was known for having this, all these thick Enlightenment volumes of Rousseau and Voltaire and Montesquieu and so on. And there were rumors in neighboring towns that intellectuals were being shot dead in the streets. And Muhammad says, to this day, I have no idea if that was true or not, but that was the impression that we had, and we had to do something to take precaution. So his father said, Muhammad to his brother, you need to build a bonfire. And that's what they did, and fed volume after volume after volume of this library into the fire to erase evidence that they were independent thinking. And when I think about what he's now doing, 3 decades later, he's reversing that bonfire to get the ideas of tolerance and the rule of law and free markets out into discussion again in Afghanistan. And I don't hold out that we're going to see a libertarian paradise break out in Afghanistan, or even a very free society over the next series of years or decades or in my lifetime. But I'm convinced that if it's going to happen, it's going to be people like Mohammad Ramzipour, like the people that are attending his programs now, that are going to be the ones that change his country in a positive direction. And I think like the real takeaway from it is just that if Professor Ramzipour can have hope in Afghanistan, then you get really tired of like those, especially in the U.S., who sort of despair that we've lost it, that our history as a country of freedom is over. I think that we all have to dig down deep. Americans, Canadians, work with people, like Matt and Janet, who are running the ILS and trying to change this country, like all the groups in the U.S. and like all the freedom champions that Atlas gets to work with all around the world. So thank you very much for having me. Is there a mic for questions? And I forget how that's working.
Brad, if I could just add something from the end of sort of where I come at this, I can't possibly agree more with what you said, and I think one of the most inspiring things that I've seen in the 25 years, I mean, I talked about SFL in the last 5, but certainly over the last 25 years, has been the growth in these kind of places. And just to give you two examples. One, it's funny you mentioned the Persian language stuff, because I have been writing some pieces and doing interviews for a Persian language magazine in Iran that's published. I don't know if you know the guy who's the guy doing this, but that's amazing to me.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to me that they're interviewing people like me for a sort of major financial magazine newspaper in Iran, and it's out there in those ways. I mean, of all the places. And the other one, I spent a morning this summer Skyping in to one of these in Ghana from our friend Kofi, right? Mm-hmm. And just the idea of there being however many he had, I think it was about 80 maybe there, mm-hmm. 80 young Ghanans willing to take a week of their time to study. I mean, it's sort of liberty and entrepreneurship or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then the technology that enabled people like me and Ian Scoble and some others to guest lecture there. I mean, that, it's amazing. And I think of the guys like that who are doing that kind of work in those kind of places. And just as you said at the end, what are we complaining about, right? I mean, that's, that's the real difficult work. And, I've been to Bratislava and other kinds of places, and just all this stuff that's happening across the world is just huge. And you guys have been a big part of that. But those, like you say, those folks in the field who are willing to take it on and make it happen,
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I don't think there's too much to add besides just to say that, and I see it almost as a two-way street. You can obviously, you're right, sorry. I think that obviously the work that Atlas does is trying to equip those who love freedom in their own countries to become totally self-sufficient and improve their countries. I also think that for those of us who are struggling with the kind of questions that Steve was talking with earlier about how do we market our ideas to new audiences and build coalitions that look unlikely if you have a sort of static view of the political divides that exist now. How do we change that? I feel like there's a lot of ammunition that we can draw from these international perspectives. Steve mentioning that the minimum wage in South Africa was a tool to oppress blacks. That is an interesting international story that sort of illuminates the debate that happens in the U.S. and Canada. And just like I think we should be able to draw a lot of reservoirs of sort of moral courage and inspiration by listening to the folks that are fighting for freedom under even more adverse conditions than we face.
You want to choose the next question first?
Oh, is it Mary Lou? Yeah. I'm going to go this way.
So 2 things. I don't know if everybody can hear me, but the Language of Liberty Institute with the Liberty and Entrepreneurship camps. I was involved in that for a number of years. So Slovakia, Slovenia, Ghana, Lithuania, Kyrgyzstan. Actually, the fellow who started the think tank in Kyrgyzstan, he was here before he started the think tank. So because he came to university over here. Yeah.
Oh,
well, actually,
okay,
there were a
right.
group of them, but
Definitely.
it was his partner that was here.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing for me was that people with these ideas existed behind the Iron Curtain. how they were able to even hold those ideas in their head in that environment always amazed me. And they basically have to go against all their family and everybody else to be able to step out and speak out on these issues. They are basically crushing tradition, and they're outcasts in their own families to do it. But my other question was very practical. How does Atlas raise their money? Where does your money come from?
Yeah. Well, I guess one thing that's important to say is just that we don't take any government funds. I think lots of people figure that we must have some sort of State Department connection, but we spend a lot less in the State Department, and I think tend to at least screw up fewer times. So all of our money is from individuals and from foundations principally, and our organization sort of grew up with sort of big foundation support. One of the better, really encouraging things in recent years is that I think we're getting better at telling the story of why this matters. So we're getting a more diversified funding base, because it's a little bit esoteric, this idea that you should be caring about people in Kyrgyzstan and that we can help them help themselves. It's a difficult direct mail sell, but we're getting a little bit better at it. So it's been really nice to see the support base actually growing in recent years in a way that it hadn't in the past. Yeah. Yeah, Paul.
Okay, I guess just my question is, what is your relationship with the various religious organizations in the countries, and possibly, do you ever do any work with I know America is the #1 missionary country in the world. Do you do any work through church groups or anything like that, or?
Yeah, I mean, we don't ourselves. Like, one of the things that we encourage, though, is that, and Jan will be dealing with this when she does her strategic plan fine-tuning within our think tank MBA, is to really think about the market that you're in and to figure out what your niche is. And a number of our partners abroad recognize that the only trusted parts of their society are the clergy. If you look at the opinions of political leaders and the media and businessmen, they're all mistrusted, but religious leaders are not. So a number of groups have sort of copied what the Acton Institute has done in the U.S. And Acton actually operates abroad and is a really good partner, with a lot of common ground with what we do. But we really encourage people to be thoughtful about the way that religious institutions and that can be an important part of their message depending on their own inclinations and the market they're operating in. In the back.
As the internet propagates broader and deeper, it seems to be on an exponential trend. How does that relate to the velocity of your ideas being disseminated across the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really exciting because the question for those who were on this side was about just how the explosion of the internet has changed the velocity by which ideas are communicated, and that we can hopefully grow our network. I hope I'm getting that pretty much right. The really exciting thing that happened to us organizationally 4 years ago now was Tom Palmer came over from the Cato Institute, and Tom had started to build some foreign language programs there. One in Russian, one in Arabic, and he had a bunch more that he wanted to. He found contractors to do. We wound up for a number of reasons saying this was a better fit at Atlas than it was at Cato, moving those in. So those have really been sort of like the we call them our discovery and outreach programs, because in parts of the world where our sort of passive strategy at Atlas, we always sort of assume that the leadership has to come from the country. It's an entrepreneur. You can't just they have to be motivated themselves. You can't go and just tell them they have to do it. We've always sort of waited for people to come to us, but there are parts of the world where that wasn't happening because the literature wasn't out there. So when Tom added these websites that were putting material out into languages where it didn't exist, and then working to get it syndicated into major newspapers, but always sending people back to those websites, those have allowed us to connect to people those that are working with Nua El Hormuzzi to do these freedom schools in different Arabic-speaking countries. And then all of the social networking sites that have grown up sort of simultaneous to this really has changed the way we can do our business. So it's a really exciting time to be in this for those reasons as well. Yeah, I think it's without a doubt accelerating. Like I wouldn't be able to quantify it in any way, but yeah, you can feel it. Are there other questions or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, Brad, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we had Cindy here a couple of years ago, and people from the audience asked her about particular parts of the world,
Okay.
and she would tell us what was happening in
Is this
those
a quiz?
parts of the world. And you said you were going to talk about Freedom Champions, so here's my quiz question to
Okay.
you. I would like to know what's happening in Poland.
Yeah.
Can you handle that question and questions of similar nature? So tell me about Freedom Champions in Poland, please.
Yeah, I mean,
One of them is here.
I'm not, well, sure.
in Poland, there's a really healthy think tank scene. And it's one of the places where I'd say there's probably, if you go to our directory, there's probably 4 or 5 different organizations that we've worked with in different capacities who are doing good work. Leszek Balcerowicz, who was the finance minister shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, spoke at our program at our Liberty Forum 2 years ago, and he's sort of become the figurehead for an organization that has recently put together this sort of like a much larger. It's a scary book in Polish that I have in my office. It's like more than 1,000 pages long. There's sort of like a David Bowie style libertarianism primer that I guess is being well distributed throughout the country. So I mean, there's a number of good groups. I don't know them in the details, but yeah, Poland's good.
So Jacek Spendel, I'm not
Okay.
sure if he actually is connected with Atlas or not, or if they're funded through the Polish American Institute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The name sounds familiar, but I don't remember.
Yeah, but they're well, the guys over in Poland aren't conservative. They are definitely libertarians, and they also run these liberty and entrepreneurship camps.
Okay.
So, but the advocate for them in the States, Jan.
Was
I
it Jan
forgot-
Malik? Is that?
Anyway, I've forgotten his name. His first name's Jan, but so they raised the money in the U.S. to help, but now they're able to raise it even in Poland, which is really great.
Yeah.
The beauty is really, I mean, you've done so much work. It touches all these different countries. It's unbelievable. You're everywhere, really, in terms of who you've helped. But there also are all sorts of other organizations that we aren't even aware of anymore. There are so many you can't even count them anymore. It's beautiful,
Right.
really beautiful.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because we talk about like we have these goals that we set internally of like expanding our network each year, and there's a little bit of hubris in there to think that we can do it, but we can kind of count on it like clockwork that we're going to have some individuals that we do play a role in helping them start something new. But more than that, we discover things that are already happening under others' volition, and we're just sort of welcoming them to this network and seeing if they'd like to partake in the different services that we offer. Any more questions or pop quiz questions? Okay. So I'm making you run, aren't I? Like,
We can pass them on.
just throw it, right?
I wanted to latch on a little bit to your question there, because you said you operate in Arabic-speaking, that is Muslim countries like Iran and, well, they're not Arabic-speaking, but anyway. Do you make an effort to find a way to adapt some of the messaging within a more Islamic context, considering that a lot of libertarian messaging is quite stridently secular? Do you make an effort to find a way to reconcile it with some of the religious preconceptions, or not in religious, cultural preconceptions that are there to reference it and to back it up with reference to their cultural precepts?
Right. I mean, I'd say that I always think that's the smarter strategy. We have worked with some groups in one group that's coming to mind in Egypt that very much were sort of cultural libertines as well as good libertarians on policy issues, and I think that sometimes that by being too strident and not trying to find a way to cater your message to existing traditions, I think that that's a smarter marketing strategy when we're actually not trying people go back to foundational things they believe their entire lives. But if we try to work within the parameters that they already accept, I think that's a smarter strategy. So most of the groups that we work with in the Islamic world are not sort of religious by nature, but they try to sell their message in a way that's respectful of the traditions that are widely held, if that makes sense. Yeah. Jesse.
Should I have the mic or?
Yeah.
I guess so. Yeah, you have to.
This is a rather concrete question. You mentioned earlier a video that didn't work, and I'm assuming that's being worked on, and you're trying to get proper. Because I think like this might be playing too much into Mr. Tucker's talk, but using video information over the internet is fantastic, and to get that like recorded would be excellent. So if that's a mistake, I'm assuming that that's all in play, and we're going to see that with soon. We can look forward to it.
We'll see. We just know that the first go around, I started to promise this. So when I started to do this kind of talk more often than I had in the past, I was sort of selling like it's coming out soon. And then all of a sudden, when we saw like the raw footage that we were trying to edit down, we're like, oh my god, it's kind of a mess. So we have to go back to square one and figure out how to get a more professional Nigerian film crew to go along with our dancing troops, and yeah, fundraising for all of this is a big question. So there's trade-offs involved, but I agree that the more that we can share the exciting work that's being done internationally via video, the better. We just have to figure out how logistically to plan it out better, especially in Africa. Okay, I'm not sure where we are on my timing and if there's any more questions, but I'm obviously around and appreciate the opportunity to meet you guys. So thanks.